In this chapter, we're going to talk about Decimation Master. Decimation Master is a plugin that's found under the Z plugin menu at the top of your screen. If we tear that off, it'll dock on the side, and you'll find Decimation Master here. Now, what Decimation Master does is it takes a very, very detailed mesh, something that may be millions of polygons, and it decimates that. And decimation is where you take a polygon, which is a square composed of 4 vertices. It triangulates it. It turns all the squares into triangles and then reduces the number of triangles in areas of low detail and keeps the triangles in areas of high detail. What that accomplishes is it takes something that looks very, very detailed like this and reduces its polygon count. This is 432,000 polygons, and you can see the triangles are smaller in areas of high detail, and areas of low detail, they're bigger. This is to facilitate 3D printing, as well as working with dense meshes, maybe in Maya, or if you've got scan data and you need to make a digital double, you can decimate that scan data so it's easier to work with, but maintain the highly detailed surface. When you're 3D printing, you want to decimate your models so they're more likely to print successfully and the 3D print software can deal with them. If you don't need to continue to sculpt or continue to work on the model, you don't need to keep millions of polygons. You can decimate it down. Sometimes it's beneficial to decimate models just to have props or accessories, have them lower resolution. If you're working with a very, very dense, very complicated model, there's many, many reasons you might choose to decimate. Typically, we don't use decimated models in an animation pipeline. There could be instances where you would be using it as a placeholder. There's instances where you'll be using it in a pipeline to facilitate creating a pipeline-ready model. So this is definitely worth knowing, even if you're not planning on doing 3D printing, as I said, for a digi-double pipeline or a variety of other applications. So this is a decimated model of a troll that I sculpted for ZBrush Live. Let's take a look at how we can create something like this. I'm going to go back to my original troll here. Now there's polypaint on this character and multiple subdivision levels. If we go to geometry, you can see we have 5 subdivision levels, and he is originally 2 million polygons. Now the character doesn't have arms and ends down here. What I want to do is I want to prep this and get it ready as a nice presentation for 3D printing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slice off sort of a scalloped area here and make a nice sort of base for this character. So to do that, I am going to use the slice and the trim brushes. I'm going to go to B for brush, T for trim, and we have a brush here called trim rectangle. If I click that, it tells me that it's going to replace the Control-Shift keys. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to delete my lower subdivision levels. Now I'm still at 2 million polygons, but I don't need to keep my subdivision levels at this point. Now, the way the trim brush works is if I Control-Shift, click and drag, I get this rectangular marquee. If I let go, everything that's inside of that marquee gets sliced away. So I can start to trim this down to about where I want the base to be. So we'll trim it to about there. Now, if we look at the bottom here, you can see it has deleted those faces and it's hole filled it. If we go into frame mode, you can see the hole filled area here. That's all triangulated, while the rest of the mesh is actually all quads. Now I want to scallop out the sides here. There's no arms on this bust, so I want to sort of give a nice curved plane here, like you might see on a bust in a museum, for example. So to get a curved plane, I'm going to go to B for brush, T for trim, and I'm going to use trim curve. Click OK. Now the trim curve brush, again, is accessed by Control-Shift, clicking and dragging, and it creates this line here. There's a feathered edge on one side and a dotted line on the other. And everything on the feathered edge is going to be trimmed away. So I'm going to start drawing this line, and I'll tap the Alt key, and that puts sort of a stop on the curve there, and I can start to curve this line. I'll tap the Alt key again, and again to get a nice curve on this. Now I can press the space bar and move this around if need be. I can place this exactly where I want it and then let go. Now what ZBrush will do is it will cut away all the faces on the feathered edge side of that line, and then it will hole fill the gap that it leaves. There you go. So let's do the same on the other side. I will Control Shift click and drag, and that starts to draw the line. Now if I find I've drawn it in the wrong direction, you can just press the space bar and move it. Press the space bar again and move. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tap the Alt key. And by the way, if you want to create a hard angle instead of a curve, just double tap the Alt key, and that puts a hard angle there. But I don't want that hard angle, so I'm going to press the space bar, move it off the model, and let go. It will still do its slicing mesh process, but it shouldn't slice anything, and if it does, we can't always undo it. There we go. You see it actually has not cut the mesh because we didn't cross over it. So Control, Alt, click and drag, and we'll tap the Alt key a couple times to get a nice curve here. And I don't quite like that curve, so I'm going to press the space bar to move that down. And let's do this. Let's do one tap and do another tap and get a nice smoother curve transition there. Bring it to about there and then let go. And once again, that'll slice that off. It'll hole fill it and give us a nice sweeping curve along the sides there, which is just a lot more aesthetically pleasing to look at. That's the thing that we want to make sure of when we're prepping this for print, is that our bust has an appealing overall feeling to it. So I like having the visual weight up here of the bust, but I don't want the shoulders to drop straight down into the base. So that said, let's go ahead and go to a side view. Now from the side view, it's quite chunky. We don't need this much base here. I'd like to have it terminate in a smaller footprint here. So I'm going to press, well, first off, let's turn off perspective. So we're snapped to a side view. And I'm actually going to move the entire figure so I can get a better plane on this. So I'm going to go to W for move, and that brings up the gizmo. I'm going to put it to the unmasked mesh center by clicking that button there. And let's go ahead and hold down the Alt key and position our pivot down here near the base. Press the pizza box stack. I think it's Paul Gabory from Pixelogic calls that the pizza boxes, and it's a nice analogy for it. It does look like a stack of boxes. This icon lets you transpose all the subtools at once. So I'm just going to rotate everything forward a little bit. And maybe just rotate it. Oops, that's the scale. Undo that. And let's just rotate it a little bit like this. So we've got a nice plane that we can cut here. Now we'll go back to Control Shift, click and drag, tap the Alt key to get a nice curve to this. And we're just going to go ahead and get a nice sweep just like this. Don't quite like that, so I'm going to tap the Alt key again. There we go. That's better. And let go. And it will slice straight through, delete all the faces on this side, and hole fill it. So then we'll get a nicer transition in this particular area. There we go. Now, if we go to frame mode, you can see it's automatically polygrouped those faces that it sliced out. So it's hard to see because the triangle or the faces are so dense. If I turn off the line button, which is here inside the polyframe button, now we can just see our color coding for polypaint. So I am going to Control Shift click on these polygroups to hide them. So now we've hidden those hole fill panels there. We'll turn off frame mode. And I just want to sample the base color here because I want those panels to actually have a color to them that's close to the base color of the character. So we'll drag this over until we get a nice base tone. Something like this. Now Control Shift click on the background. Now Control Shift click right now is my trim brush. So I want to select, once again, my select rectangle. So we'll do this. That will replace the Control Shift key button. So just click skip this note and it'll stop giving you that update. Now Control Shift click drag on the background. That will invert my masking. And there you can see the panels that it hole filled. And I'll go to RGB, color, fill object. And that will fill those with that base color. Now the reason I did that is because some 3D printers will actually print color, and I want to show you how you can decimate and maintain your polypaint in case you want your 3D print to maintain that color information. So we have our character now. Let's go ahead and put a base on there. I'm going to go to Subtool, and I will append a polymesh star. We'll select that polymesh star and press W to bring up the transpose gizmo again. Now remember we turned on the pizza box stack. Turn that off so we're only moving the polymesh star down here to the bottom. I'll change my color back to white so it doesn't appear to be the same color as the figure. Now if I press the gizmo gear icon here, I can change this to a primitive. I'll do polycylinder. And if we zoom in here, you see this gives us a polygon cylinder, and I can change my polygon resolution by adjusting the slider. If I want to see my frame, just turn on frame mode again. This is Shift F. And remember to turn line back on, and now that will actually show you your polygon edges. So we can add a subdivision level to this. So this is actually decent for our resolution. So I will press the W key, and that brings us back into the gizmo. Hold down the Shift key, and I will rotate this 90 degrees. You see that 90-degree readout on the bottom there. And we'll scale this up, and we'll scale it down to serve as our base. Let's scale this up so it's big enough to sort of support the figure. Let's move it back so the visual weight is back here, and we'll move it up so it's countersunk with the figure itself. And we don't have to have the base quite so thick, so let's scale this down, bring it forward just a little bit. We'll turn on perspective mode and turn off frame mode with Shift F. So now you can see that we've got a base applied here. Now when we 3D print, if we have two objects which intersect with each other, the 3D printer will treat that as one volume. So this base will be printed as a single object with the bust as long as they're sent to the printer together as a single STL file. And we'll see how to do that shortly. Press the Q key to exit out of the gizmo. And what I want to do now is I want to add a bevel to the edges of this. So I'll do Shift F, and I'll go to B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and I will select the Z modeler brush here. Now the Z modeler brush is a poly modeling tool inside of ZBrush. It allows you to do operations on edges and faces and points. It's contextual, and we have an entire video just on ZModeler. So if you have not seen that yet and you don't understand ZModeler, we'll go into this in more depth in another video. But for this base, I just want to bevel the edges here. Press the space bar while you're moused over an edge, and this gives you the operations which you can apply to edges. And I want to put a bevel on here, so I'll put bevel, and I'll do edge loop complete. And we can set the number of rows, 2 rows, 4 rows. We can adjust our sharpness, etc. So linear edge, sharp edge, soft edge. Click and drag. And then that gives us this bevel. And I could do the same thing down here if I want to bevel the base at the bottom as well. But I'll leave that flat. Shift F turns off frame mode. And then I'll just add a couple subdivision levels to this until it smooths out nicely. So now we have our base. So let's go back up to our bust. Let's select the head itself. Now you see that we've got subtools here for eyes, teeth, and the base itself. So let's go ahead and decimate the creature's head. Now, when you're 3D printing, depending on the size of the print that you're going to create, you might want to actually print your object hollow. And the reason for that is the print material, the resin itself, is the most expensive element of the 3D print. So this object, as it stands, will be a solid volume. However, we can create a volume thickness. That means that there's a wall thickness where if you were to inset the surface of this creature in by, millimeters, centimeters, you can have it hollow on the inside. And that means that it requires less material to build and therefore will cost less when you're printing it. Now, depending on whether or not you own your own printer and the costs of the printer material, you may choose to do this or not. I'm going to go ahead and show you anyway how to do it so you have this tool in your arsenal. I'm going to turn on solo mode. And we're going to Dynamesh the mesh again to do this. So we'll go down to Dynamesh. Now we want to keep all of our details, so I need to turn my Dynamesh resolution up pretty high. So set our Dynamesh resolution high enough that we maintain our polypaint detail and we maintain our sculpted detail. So let's go ahead and click Dynamesh. And there we go. We are in Dynamesh mode now, and we haven't lost any resolution. If we go into frame mode and turn on line again, you can see it is quite dense. Now, I want to use this Create Shell button here to create a thickness. So this is a hollow shell, so it's going to take less material to print, but this is going to be dependent on your scale. If you print this small, this wall thickness here needs to be thicker, otherwise you may have an object that's too thin to print. We have a utility that will help us understand the wall thickness. It's polypaint from thickness, which we'll talk about later. But for now, let's look at how we can create a shell. And this is useful for other things as well. Maybe you want to create an object with a shell for a prop or a bit of modeling. You can still use this for other tools, for other things in addition to 3D printing. So we're in Dynamesh mode. I'm going to go to B for brush, I for insert, and go to IMM primitives. Insert cylinder. Hold down the Alt key, click and drag, and that's going to insert a cylinder. And the normals on this are going to be reversed. So if we go into frame mode, you'll be able to see the normals are reversed on that cylinder, and that just helps us see that it is a subtraction object. If I press the W key to bring up the transpose gizmo, it's automatically oriented to the axis of that object. So I just want to make sure it's countersunk into the figure without coming out on the opposite end. Now, if I click Create Shell, it will create a Dynamesh shell. So all I need to do is click that. We'll first clear the mask and then click Create Shell. And it's going to offset the surface inside, and it's going to subtract the cylinder out. So you're going to have a hole there and a shell thickness. Now, some 3D printers require that there be a drain there for a filler material. If there was a wax support structure or wax support material, that hole would allow it to drain out of the object. If your printer doesn't use a wax support, you may not need to have a hole there. You might be able to just create a shell on your own. It's good to see the thickness though, so this may take a bit of time to process. So we'll let that sit, and I will pause the recording and we'll come back when it's complete so we don't have to sit here and watch ZBrush think. And now it has completed. You see that the cylinder disappears. I'll turn off frame mode. And now if we rotate around to the back, here we have a thickness. And you can see there is the inner shell. There is the thickness. If we zoom in here, you can see the actual thickness of the region here. If I go into frame mode, it's a bit easier to see. Let's turn on polyframe edges there. There you go. So you can see that that actually has thickness to it. Now, again, I stress that depending on the overall scale of your print, this may or may not be too thin. So you would have to adjust your thickness using the thickness slider here. So let's go ahead and turn off frame mode. And of course, you can make the cylinder smaller, so you can make that hole bigger or smaller depending on how big or small that cylinder actually is. So that is how we create a thickness shell. And that is a separate polygon surface inside. If we go into frame mode and turn off the polyline again, you can see that that's actually a different polygroup. So don't be fooled into thinking that's the backside of the outer shell. That is an inner shell sitting inside of the model. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off frame mode. And I'm actually going to undo back because for this particular one, we don't really need that drain back there, but I did want to show you how to make that shell. Turn off Dynamesh, and now we're ready to actually decimate this creature. So turn off solo mode. So we're going to be we're going to be decimating this subtool, the head. So under Decimation Master, we have all these options. I'm going to turn on Use and Keep Polypaint. That's going to maintain the polypaint. Now, we have a polypaint weight. Now, obviously, if you reduce your poly count, it could reduce the polypaint data. So we can turn up polypaint weight, and Decimation Master will take into account the polypaint detail as well as the sculptural details. Typically, your polypaint is concentrated in areas of high detail as well as sculptural detail. So 25 usually works for me, but you can adjust this value to make changes on a case-by-case basis. The important thing is if we want to maintain our poly paint, turn on Use and Keep Poly Paint. Now, we want to come down here and we want to pre-process current. Now, I can pre-process the tool that I'm currently on, or I can pre-process all of the tools. So you might save time if you're going to decimate everything and pre-process everything. What this does is it writes out a cache file for each subtool. That cache file is used by Decimation Master to help decimate the mesh. Now, if you find when you're using Decimation Master that you get unexpected results, maybe you put in a certain thousands of polygons value and it obviously doesn't give you that, the cache file may have corrupted, in which case just click Delete Caches and then pre-process current for your current Z tool, and that will reprocess that current subtool, and then you can decimate it again. So let's go ahead and do this one by one. I'm going to decimate, or I'm going to pre-process my current subtool by pressing Pre-Process Current. Now, up here, there's going to be a status bar. It's analyzing the mesh. And then in a moment, you'll see a status bar that creeps along the top of the screen as it starts to write that cache file. Now, depending on how dense your model is, this may take a bit of time. It might go very, very quickly. It's entirely dependent on how dense and how detailed that particular Z tool happens to be. In this case, it's going pretty quickly. Decimation Master is amazing. When I first started working with ZBrush, there was no Decimation Master yet. I was working for a company called Gentle Giant Studios, and we actually, to the best of my knowledge, did the first commercially available collectible that was printed from a ZBrush sculpture. And the reason why it was so difficult back in 2005, 2006 was there were no decimation tools on the market that were affordable to the average user. We were using, I believe, SolidWorks, which is an extremely expensive program, or at the time it was an extremely expensive program for manufacturing, and it had an extremely effective decimation tool built into it. Commercially, otherwise, there was a freeware tool that would decimate meshes, but generally things couldn't handle the millions of polygons that you had in ZBrush. And so we were able to decimate the meshes and then export and create a 3D printable version of a Z tool. I believe it was a Grindilo for Harry Potter collectibles at Gentle Giant. That was 3D printed from a Z tool and then cast in wax and further sculpted and then manufactured. So now I think the vast majority of manufacturing for collectibles and whatnot is done through ZBrush. So time's changed very, very quickly. It's writing the cache file to disk now. And there we go, it's completed. So now we can go down to step 3, which is setting our decimation. So you can set the percentage, thousands of polys, thousands of points. I only ever use thousands of polys. I like to put in a very specific value here and then decimate current. So let's go ahead and zoom in so we can see our character very, very clearly. If you look at the top of the screen, we have 3 million polygons right now. So if I set this to 900,000 polygons and click Decimate Current, up here you see it's applying the decimation, and it's completed. And it doesn't seem like anything happened, but if we go into frame mode and turn on our polyline, you can see it's actually decimated. If I undo that, it'll return to its original density. So that's 900,000. We can make this lower. Let's set it to 500,000. Decimate current, and I'll leave frame mode on so you can see what happens. You see it's reduced the overall polygon count. Shift F, you see we're maintaining all of our detail and all of our poly paint. I'm going to undo that again. I believe we could go even lower than that. See, we're back to our original density. We'll set this quite low. We'll set it to 200,000. That's 20,000. Set it to 200, and then decimate current. And now it's completed. Now we're starting to see a little bit of faceting. But keep in mind, this is only going to be visible at whatever scale we have this object printed. So if this object is going to be printed at about this size, you're not going to see those facets down there. So keep that in mind, what your ultimate scale is going to be. So we have decimated the head. Now, let's say that I'm looking at this and I say, okay, well, I'm happy with this, but I want to make an adjustment to it. Maybe I want to add a little bit of detail right here. Now, I don't want to have to divide my model again to do that, but luckily we have Sculptors Pro mode. Now, there's an entirely different video where we talk about this particular tool, but I find it particularly useful in 3D printing and decimation. So Sculptors Pro mode is accessed up here. So right now I'm on the Dam Standard brush. The Dam Standard brush does this. I'm going to quick save my work. It creates these sort of creases in the mesh, and you see that I'm getting this very, very faceted look here because it's all triangulated. Let's undo those. If I want to add some details after I've decimated, but I don't want to divide the mesh again, turn on Sculptors Pro mode, and what this will do is it will tessellates the mesh while it sculpts. So what's happening here is if we turn on frame mode, this brush stroke triangulates the mesh so it can support the detail that I'm trying to sculpt there. So this is a really great way that we can localize and isolate detail if we want to add something to a mesh that we're about to 3D print, but we don't want to have to divide it again. So I can come through here and I can start adding some details like this. Maybe I want to put some wrinkles here. Maybe I want to, deepen this brow wrinkle because it's not quite deep enough to show up in the print. I'm able to do these changes. And if you watch the total polygon count, it will update, but it doesn't update by a massive amount. This is not like having to go in there and completely subdivide again and then redo your decimation. This allows me to spot detail as required. So we'll just add a few more wrinkles around the mouth here, maybe something there and there. Maybe we'll put something down here under the eyes. And maybe I want to change this area here. If I press the space bar, that's smooth. I'm going to turn off RGB so I don't smooth my poly paint. I'm only smoothing triangles. Now, if I'm in Sculptors Pro mode, let me go into frame mode so you can see this, and I hold down the Shift key. Smooth will add triangles, so I can increase density in areas that maybe went a little too triangulated. So if I want to just increase density just in this area here, I can do that using the smooth brush. So let's go in here and smooth this out, and then I'll use my Dam Standard brush with Sculptors Pro mode just to tighten up these eye bag wrinkles here. There we go. Turn off Sculptors Pro mode, and there you go. That's going to come in really handy too when you're trying to do things like create articulations or balls and sockets or pins and sockets for your figures. Being able to clean things up with Sculptors Pro mode is really valuable. I also use that a lot if I'm working with scan data that I've decimated and I want to smooth out maybe hair and create a bald head from someone that had was scanned that had hair. So now we have decimated this down to 200,000 faces. Let's go to the eye subtool and let's take a look at our eyes. The eyes are only 40,000 faces. If we go into solo mode and take a look at these, we don't really need to decimate this. It doesn't add too terribly much to the overall polygon count, but we will do it anyway. We've got use and keep poly paint turned on. I'll pre-process current, and that's going to write a cache file. And now I'm just going to set my target polys. So right now it's 49,000 faces. So let's set this to 10,000 faces. Decimate current. And there you go. So we see faceting there, but again, remember, what is your scale? What size will these be when they're printed will have an impact on whether or not those facets are going to play a role. If that's too faceted, you can undo it, and we can double this because it's at 50,000 faces. If we set it to 20,000, that's still less. So let's decimate current. And there you go. That looks better. We'll select the teeth. So here, let's put a little bit more detail in the teeth. The teeth are 245,000 faces right now. And if we go to the geometry menu, you can see we don't even have any subdivisions on here. So let's add a couple subdivision levels and let's put some detail on there. We're at 3 million. That's probably not, we don't quite need 3 million for the teeth. We're at 983,000 faces. So go to solo mode and we'll use just the Dam Standard brush to add some kind of little streaks along the tooth here, some weathering. Just giving that a little bit of detail. Dam Standard brush is one of my favorite brushes. It's a lot like in clay sculpting when you take a sculpting tool and use it through plastic wrap to sort of soften the edges of your stroke. That's what the Dam Standard brush feels like. It's really great for wrinkles and all sorts of shapes. It's one of my 5 top brushes, as you already know if you've watched the any of the videos before this. I've talked about it several times in the course of these lectures. I just want to put some striations in here. The backs aren't going to be visible, but I often sculpt things where it's not going to be seen. It doesn't take an enormous amount of time, and it just helps tie everything together. A little anecdote that's always stuck with me is Jack Pierce, the artist who created that famous makeup of Frankenstein's monster in the Universal film. He sculpted pores and details in the Frankenstein makeup that would be underneath the hair. And he knew that there would be hair over it, but it always sort of stuck with me that he took that attention to detail. There we go. So now we've got some detail there on those teeth. I'll go to the smooth brush, make sure RGB is turned off, so we're not smoothing our poly paint, we're just smoothing form. And let's smooth that. There we go. So we've got use and keep poly paint turned on. We will pre-process current, and that again will write out a cache file. That's processing. It's not too dense of a mesh, so it'll go pretty quickly. There's a little bump right there that I can use Sculptress Pro mode to smooth out, so we'll fix that in just a moment. There we go. It has written out the cache file. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to check my poly count. It's 983,000. Let's dial back these teeth to, let's try 50,000 faces. Hit decimate current. And there we go. There's no noticeable change on the surface, but if we go into frame mode, you see they have been reduced considerably. So let's alt-click on the head again. And there's that little bump right there. Let's fix this. Let's turn our Sculptress Pro mode back on, and let's smooth this out. And I'm going to turn my brush size up a little bit, and that'll make bigger triangles. There we go. And I'll use my Dam Standard brush just to crease this in. Let's make this a little bit sharper and deeper so that mouth really does feel like it's got some depth to it. I'm going to turn on solo mode so I can get through those teeth. And let's just crease that in there using the Dam Standard. Nice and sharp. Those deep areas of creasing will cast a nice shadow on the final print and make it feel even better. There we go. Maybe we want to fix this little bit right here. Let's put a little bit of a wrinkle coming out of the mouth here. And there, maybe we do another little wrinkle here. There we go. Much better. Let's turn solo off so we get our teeth and eyes back. So now we have the head, the eyes, and the teeth all decimated and ready for print. So that leaves us with the base. What shall we do with the base? Well, I'd like to show you how you can put a nameplate on the base. Now, if you've watched the video on folders, which I'm assuming you have if you've gotten this far in, but if not, feel free to go back and revisit it. We're going to organize this into folders. So I'm going to create a new folder here, new folder, and I'm going to call this head. And that's got the head in the folder. I'm going to put the eyes inside the folder and the teeth inside the folder. I can change their order just by clicking and dragging them. And now collapse that folder. Now that leaves the base outside of the folder. Now I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this base. Now the base is sitting inside the folder, and I'm going to append a polymesh star. I'm going to select that star. What I want to do is I want to put a nameplate on here so we can print a little name on our base. So I'll go to the Move Gizmo, and we'll drag this forward, and let's turn this into a polycube. I'm going to use Booleans to Boolean out a nameplate here. So let's go ahead and scale this down, like so. Let's move it and turn off perspective mode so we get a dead-on front view. Let's move it down here, scale it up. Let's scale it in X. Bring it back here. And we'll leave it actually sitting straight up for right now. Let me undo that so it's sitting straight up and down. There we go. Now I want to create a name for this creature. So to do that, I'm going to go to the Z plugin menu, and there is text and 3D vector shapes here. So I'm going to click New Text, and we'll type a name for this creature. So we'll just call him, let's say he's Terrence the Troll. So his name is Terrence. Now, this creates text as a new subtool, but the font isn't all that great for printing. So let's go ahead and change the font. I'll come over here to the font selector, and let's grab something a little bit more bold and thick that will kind of look more dramatic and probably print better. So we'll scroll down the list here and see if we don't have, and all of your installed fonts should be on here. There's Trajan, which is a little bit of a cliche, but it should print nicely. Also, an Arial will probably print well. So if we come back up here to, these are in alphabetical order. Oops. Let's scroll back up. There's Arial. If I want to edit the text, I can click Edit, and I can make this all caps. So, Terrence the Troll. There we go. Now it's all bold. I can change, if I have variations between regular and bold, I can change those here. This particular font doesn't have those, but if I change to, let's say, well, that one actually isn't going to be printable. Let's see. There we go. That's a good one. We have various options here, black, black oblique, book. So we can scroll through the different options. We also have the ability to thicken that text. I want to increase the extrusion on it. So I'm going to turn the extrusion up, and that makes it thicker. And we can change the spacing. Now, it's listed as spacing here, but anyone who's done any typography knows that this is actually kerning. This is the space between the letters. So technically that's called kerning. So we can change our kerning for a better look. And we can also change the bevel. And I like to put a little bit of a bevel on the edges of those letters. Now this is already a sculptable mesh. So I can just take this and move it down here. And let's scale it down so it fits onto that nameplate. Let's place it here, countersink it. So it's intersecting that nameplate, just like this. There we go. Now I'm going to select the nameplate here, and I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm going to call this nameplate. And I'm going to take the text and put that inside that folder. Now I want to move this entire grouping into the base. So I'm going to click the gear icon here and make it a transpose set. Now you will have seen this in our video on folders. This just takes all the objects that are inside that folder and makes them transposable while the others are not. So now I can just take this and I can place it exactly where I want it. Maybe I want to rotate them all a little bit to an angle here. So they're actually sitting like this. I'm going to countersink that just like so. And maybe this needs to be scaled a little bit in X. There we go. Great. Now I'm going to take the box here, which is the back plate from my nameplate. I'm going to take this and I am going to duplicate it. And I'm going to drag this up into the base folder. So they're in the same space, but in different folders. Oops, let's put that inside that folder and put the base above it. There we go. Now we're going to do some Booleans. I'm going to select the base, and I'm going to turn off visibility on my nameplate. Now I've got this box here. I am going to click this button here, this little subtraction button. This will subtract from the tool above it when I turn on Live Boolean. So I'm going to turn on Live Boolean, and you see it's actually Booleaning out. But because it's not completely penetrating that surface, it's actually leaving a little bit of extra space there. So I'm going to go to W for transpose, and I'm going to scale it out like this. Let's turn off frame mode. Now you can see it's giving us a nice scalloped surface, or subtracted surface, I should say, for our nameplate. There you go. Now let's go back to our nameplate and let's turn on visibility on that. And you see our nameplate now has a nice place to sit here. I'm going to make a transpose set for the nameplate, and let's just countersink this down into that space. Let's go back to transpose and just bring this forward. There we go. So now that is countersunk, but we've got this little scallop here that we don't particularly like. So I'm going to go back to this subtraction object. I'm going to scale this in this direction. Oops, got the wrong one selected. Make sure that I don't have the pizza box stack selected. Now we can scale that up and then slice it like that. Shift F to turn off frame mode, and there you go. Now we get a nice sliced plane there for our nameplate. I'll go to the text of the nameplate, and we'll turn on subtract for that. Now, if you're confused at all by this, we have an entire video just on Booleans. So if you haven't seen it yet, fear not, you can watch the video on Booleans, get a lot more information. But here you go. Now we have an actual Boolean subtraction of our nameplate. Terrence the Troll. So I've got these two folders here, which are Boolean objects, but I need to make them actually 3D printable because these aren't 3D printable. If I go into frame mode, you can see that the Boolean object still exists. Click the gear icon and click Boolean folder, and that will create a new object. It hides the folder, and this new object is actually a Booleanable, or excuse me, a 3D printable shape. There's our printable. Let me turn on solo so it's easier to see. There's a printable nameplate. We'll do the same thing for the base. We'll come up here to base, Boolean folder. And there we go. Let's bring that folder down, or that base down here. Turn off frame mode. And there we go. So these are both actual polygon objects now. ZBrush has made them polygons based on the Boolean operation that we just did. So these are not Booleaned anymore. These are actually physical objects. So we don't need to worry about these two folders. As a matter of fact, if you save your work, you can always delete these and save a new iteration. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all on that folder. And I will delete all on this folder. So now I have the head and I've got the base. So since we've taken the time to put color on the head, and let's put a little bit of color on the base. Maybe we want our base to be sort of a neutral tone. So we've got this base color here. Let's select the base color and let's go to maybe a blue and desaturate that. So it's a little blue-gray. And let's go ahead and go to RGB, color, fill object. And we'll do the same for the nameplate. So turn on perspective so we get a nice look at our character. So now we have an object that is 400,000 faces. Very easy to 3D print something at that size. So how do we go about 3D printing? Well, we need to establish the scale, and we need to save it out in a file format that can be easily read by a 3D printer. So let's take a look at how to do that now. So to get this object out into a printable format, we will go back to the Z plugin menu, and from there we will open 3D Print Hub. Now this allows us to import STL files and export STLs, OBJs, and VMRL files. So STL files are the most common 3D print file format. It's for stereolithography. They will export as binaries or ASCIIs, and they will support RGB, vertex color, polypaint. VMRL will be best for 3D printing if you're printing color with the texture map. So this will export with a texture map if you did elect to do that by preserving your UVs in Decimation Master. Then lastly, we have export to OBJ. And OBJ, most of you are probably familiar with. It's the most common generic 3D file format. So to begin with, we're going to update our size ratios. So this will tell us what the size of the object is. Well, that's the closest, I think, to what we want, 6.26 inches. Now I can set my value here. So if I open up size options, I can move bounding box to axis at origin. That moves the object to origin. For all tools, I want to make sure that the same bounding box is used for everything. Otherwise, all those subtools will end up stacked up together in the wrong position. Now, if I click Use Size of Selected Subtool, I can set the overall size of the object using this button here, this slider here. If this is turned off, it will update just this subtool to whatever size I place there, and then scale everything else in relation to that. So it'll end up being a little bit bigger than this value. So let's go ahead and set our target size. Let's make this quite a big bust. We'll make it 12 inches high in the Y direction. Now I'm going to come down here and I can export to STL, export to VMRL, export to OBJ. We'll open up our options. I'm going to export all subtools, not just selected, not just visible, but all. I don't have anything hidden. If I did have things hidden, then I would probably just select visible. Export to separate files is turned off because I want this all to be exported as a single mesh. You can turn on textures or polypaint. Because we're using polypaint here, I'll turn polypaint on, and I'll use an STL binary format that will support per vertex color, but it depends on the printer whether or not it will print that. And I can save these settings if I want to save them for later. Now I'm just going to click Export to STL, and then I will save this to a location that I prefer as an STL file. So we'll save this as troll.stl. It's just right over that previous one. And files were successfully exported. So I click on that menu and it goes away. Now I might want to check to make sure it exported correctly. So if I go to the polymesh star here, I can check my export. I'll just go to Import STL file and just import that troll.stl. STL read in successfully. And if I go to my import options, I have skip color turned on. So if I turn that off and then import STL file again, now it comes in with the color. So that just is good to verify your STL has everything in there. Otherwise, you're in for a sad shock if you send something off for print and you're actually missing big chunks of it. So that completes this look at Decimation Master and 3D Print Hub. This will give you all the tools you need to take your objects, decimate them, and prepare them for 3D printing. And there's so many options for 3D printing now, between owning your own printer or using online services, or most major cities are going to have a 3D print service bureau available to you, either through a foundry or through a specialized 3D printing service house. So I hope you've enjoyed this chapter, and I will see you in the next video.